If we had complied with the Constitution and the global political agreement, we would already have had a constitution, we probably would have already gone to elections, and we would be living in very different circumstances than we are now. But unfortunately, that's not the reality, and I think those are some of the challenges that we face, that it's not about compliance with the law, it's not about complying and honoring our principles and the undertakings which have been made, but it's become a very politicized process, and we have to be aware of that political environment in which we live. So currently we remain captive to the will of politicians rather than the will of the people of the country. And I think for this reason it's very critical that the voice of civil society continues to be heard, that their efforts continue to be supported, that they continue to be protected so that they can bring out information drafting. We've seen more sidelining of the civil society and inadequate representation of stakeholders. The process has effectively been removed from the public domain, and it's become an issue of three political parties with their technical representatives, their political representation through COPAC, the Constitutional Select Committee, and they are the ones who have been discussing the issues, reviewing parts of the draft, and then feeding back information and changing things. We also wanted to have access, not to the drafters, to see every word that they were writing, but to see what was coming out in that draft constitution, and to be able to compare it against the issues which we had seen when we shadowed the outreach process, but also to see whether the issues which were in the official report of the outreach process had been mirrored in the draft that was being produced. And unfortunately, that is an area of contestation still. We haven't been able to see those. And it seems that we're going to have to wait and see how things pan out when the final draft is finally produced. We have some remaining processes to get to the end of the constitution making. There is still a second all-stakeholders conference where broader society should be able to look at the draft, to reflect on it, to amend it, to make suggestions, and then to adopt it before it's sent to Parliament. And then it will be gazetted for the referendum. And then people will vote whether or not they would want that constitution. But we see that these processes are going to become more and more politicized as we move towards the end. We've seen a lot of intimidation over the last few months. Different interest groups are being taken advantage of by politicians, and they're pushing for particular content issues. They're also being pushed to take particular sides and to push certain political agendas. So what we will probably see at the end of the day is a compromise document which the political parties believe will best serve their political interests, their party interests, and even their own personal interests. Because this is a document which they feel, as they move towards an election, would be something they can work with and something that they can use to be able either to consolidate their power or to be able to build power. So I was reminded particularly of the mirror of the national soul. And in Zimbabwe, I think the national soul that we see now as we look into the mirror is one of three political parties who are putting what they want into a constitution and not really worrying about the broader national interests. And for this reason, Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights has taken a position that this is a transitional document. Because it is a compromise document, it will never be a document which can really reflect a society when you have these contestations of power, when you don't have one center of power. However, it's a necessary political process. It's something which we need to have as we move towards a new round of elections and a possible opening of the space in the country. I wanted to just flag out some of the flash points which I think people can look out for, and some of the issues which need to be focused on to try and bring the process a bit more into what can I say, just to try and make it a bit more inclusive, to try and remedy some of the things which we feel maybe if attention is paid to them now, there may be a possibility that things can improve. The highly charged operating environment, which continues to persist in Zimbabwe, is another issue which is going to be problematic, and it will work to the advantage of those who want to subvert the process. So the issues which we always talk about relating to the operating environment need to be looked at and to be addressed. And the final question that I have on the Constitution is, even if we do have a new Constitution, which is very good, I mean, it's a possibility that you'll get something which is very good, it protects a lot of rights, it really sets up institutions which can be independent, which tries to stem corruption and that kind of thing. Will that automatically lead to respect for that Constitution? Will it lead to proper implementation of its principles and of its provisions? Because we have a problem in the country where we have laws which, if they were respected, rights would be respected. Even the Constitution, as it is now, flawed as it is, has some provisions which can protect and which can promote rights. But it's the culture of being able to say that we respect this, we comply with it, along with the other laws which are there in the country. And I think without a change of political mindset and the political will to be able to implement that Constitution, we still have a long battle ahead. The Constitution is important, but it's not the only fundamental requirement or impediment to resolving the Zimbabwe question. So before I end, I just wanted to highlight that issue so that we look at the Constitution in a broader context. The global political agreement was set up amongst, for other reasons, to address the issue of democratization. Certain provisions were put in there to try and open up the environment, to make the framework a lot better, to be able to contribute towards a free and fair election in the future, an election where people would be able to go and cast their vote, an election in which their vote would be respected, their will would be respected, and where the outcome would not be disputed. Because all of these were issues which were up for debate and were very contentious and were not addressed in the 2008 elections. These issues, which remain sidelined and unaddressed, include the key issue of institutional reforms, particularly those institutions which protect the electoral process. In 2008, the police became a law unto themselves. They were able to go and arrest people regardless of whether or not crimes had been committed. They were able to turn a blind eye to perpetrators who were committing crimes in certain areas, and that built up a culture of impunity. You had a prosecuting authority, the Attorney General, who did not prosecute perpetrators of politically motivated violence, of electoral violence and crimes which arose in 2008. And that allowed impunity to continue. You had a judiciary which, when it was called upon to decide and to ensure that results were released on time in terms of the law of the country, were not able to deliver the protection which we needed. You have a Human Rights Commission which has been set up for more than 3 years and which still doesn't have a statute which will allow it to begin its operations. These are all critical institutions which need to be looked at, where reforms need to be made, Because if those institutions, together with the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission itself, which hasn't substantively changed in any way, particularly at the administrative or the operational level, they are not going to be able to protect the electoral process. The legislative framework, which allowed people to be selectively arrested, maliciously prosecuted, which allowed the media to be quietened, to not be able to talk about issues and to provide information, that legislative framework has remained completely untouched since before 2008, although the global political agreement calls for key legislative reforms to be made. And there's no political will, like I said before, to abide by the laws that are there, by the protective provisions which are there. Politically motivated violence persists up to this day. The statistics are there. Anyone can look at them. People can try and pretend that political violence is not happening. People can try and say that human rights defenders are not being persecuted in the country. But the statistics are there. People are in those police holding cells, people are in the prisons, people are awaiting trial, and there are perpetrators who are still not in those same places where human rights defenders find themselves. So that is an issue which has not been addressed and which was clearly indicated in the global political agreement. Those issues still remain suppressed. The media itself, the reforms that were needed for a strong media, a media which will be able to provide alternative views, which will allow journalists who remain outside the country to come home and practice their profession, have not been substantively reformed. Don't be fooled by the number of newspapers you might see on the streets in the country. They censor themselves if they're independent media, because they don't want to be arrested. The state-controlled media, of course, nothing much has changed there. If you hear from politicians that, yes, we've opened up, we've licensed new players, look at who those players are before we decide whether the media has really been reformed and is ready to be able to provide accurate information which is in the public interest when it comes to a new election. And finally, the insecurity of human rights defenders and the clampdown on NGOs. Those are critical issues which have not been addressed. And this is not just a hymn that we read from a hymn book. People often say to us, you civil society people, you NGO folk, you just talk about the same issues, you don't want to give credit where it's due. But I think that we do give credit where it's due. We believe there have been some attempts to improve certain parts of society, the economy, some of the social service and the delivery systems. But when it comes to these fundamental issues which will decide whether or not a new election will be able to happen in a stable operating environment where people can freely go and cast their vote, these are issues which need to be addressed. The facts are there, the figures are there, the information is there, and the evidence is there. And I think that is part of the reason why there's a new concerted effort to clamp down on NGOs in Zimbabwe, particularly those who are able to provide that information, because it's there for people who want to look at it. So my final thoughts of how we need to move forward to address these issues by all stakeholders. A lot of these issues are not looked at by the political parties, either because they're busy with the constitution-making process, they're preparing themselves for elections, they're making sure that their structures are reinvigorated and they're playing out their political battles even within their own parties or not, which puts a greater burden on the broader civil society, on the region, and on areas where we haven't really had a lot of interest or collaboration. We need to look at other stakeholders. When you look at some of the information which has been coming out from the country, some of the groups which feel that they've been sidelined, we need to include all of those stakeholders. 2012 is not an election year. It should be a year for reforms. It should be a year for substantive reforms. What has happened is, with the politicization of the process, these issues that I've talked about have been left on the sidelines and they've not been addressed. And because space has been given, time has been given, and issues have been prioritized, like the constitution-making process, there hasn't been that political will to really address those issues which are going to be necessary if we are not going to have a repeat of 2008. So what we need is to try and push for those reforms with a new sense of urgency. The need for renewed sense of urgency and energy which is needed to address these issues. Not just some of the flaws which are which have become apparent with the constitution making, but those other critical issues under the global political agreement. 2012 is not an election year. If you look at what some of the issues which are coming out from civil society in Zimbabwe, from the region as well, there is a belief that without those reforms, we should not be in a position to go to another election. So we believe that there needs to be pressure to deal with those issues which need reforms, those issues which need attention, and those issues which are very substantive, because those are the things which can deliver on the promises of the global political agreement. I'm just going to respond to the question about the Human Rights Commission bill and the Electoral Amendment bill. Well, the technical reason why they're stuck is that Parliament, the session lapsed and they need to be reintroduced by the Minister of Justice and Legal Affairs. And he hasn't done that yet, and there seems to be an impasse. There's no way to force that. But I think looking at it a bit deeper, any time there seems to be a possibility of an institution which might scrutinize things a bit more, which might reach out and start trying to gather information and resolve issues, like JOMIC, the Joint Monitoring and Implementation Committee, the decentralization of JOMIC, the setting up of a Human Rights Commission which wants and has shown that it might be able to have some teeth if it's given a correct mandate, then there seems to be a stalling of processes. Again, there's a lot of politicization with other pieces of legislation. The Cabinet Committee on Legislation, which is supposed to agree on the policy and that before the bills can be brought, is not doing that. That is where things are being stopped. And it's that reason why you see some of the MPs bringing in private members' bills, because they're becoming frustrated with that blockage at the level of the Cabinet Committee. How far SADC can intervene on this? I mean, we don't want to keep rushing back to SADC for every single thing which is not being implemented. These are things which have been agreed, timelines have been set, they've been missed, and I think that there needs to be more fighting of impunity at the local level. And the political parties need to devise some new strategies of how to push for implementation, rather than always leaving it to others to do. And I feel that sometimes that is just not possible. They're bogged down, they don't have ideas, and they can't hold each other to account. And as long as that continues to happen, then we'll continue to have these blockages.